Hey guys, it's Paul, combat veteran, MMA fighter, YouTuber, and we are back at it, checking out the next part of the Siege of Vraks. This is the Imperium Strikes Back. Let's get into it.
Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome to part 2 of the Siege of Vraks. In the first episode, we looked at how the impregnable fortress world of Vraks fell to the great enemy in the first place. And in this case, it turns out that even the mightiest of fortifications have little in the way of defenses against an enemy from within. At the very least, an enemy as powerful as Cardinal Zaphon. But with the capture of Vraks, on one hand, a massive success and complete triumph for Cardinal Zaphon, but on the other hand, also one that puts him squarely in the spotlight of the Imperium. He was no longer merely suspected by the Inquisition. As far as they were concerned, he had shown his true colors. And all that remained now was to see how the Imperium was going to respond to him.
You know, I maintain that if there's one thing you can always count on with those like authoritarian egomaniacs, whether they're in the corporate world, the mega billionaire class, the egotistical dictators of some country, is that they are always survivors, and they are able to always do the math and understand when they're going to bite off more than they can chew. So in the real scenario, right, someone like this Zaphon, he would know that pissing off the Imperium was just not the way to go about it. And so, you know, I think in the real world, you would see someone with his level of savvy and political competence would take the route of framing his opponents as being heretics or framing the government as being corrupt. And because ultimately we know that the Imperium, as long as you pay your tithes and you don't actively work against them or for the forces of chaos or Xenos, the Imperium doesn't give a crap who governs their countries or their planets or their sectors. So if he wants to install a theocracy with himself as the dictator, he's perfectly able to do it. He just needs to stay on the Imperium's good side. And again, if you were actually that level of sophisticated a political actor, you would not make this mistake. But it's also true that mass popular movements always get out of hand. Not always. Almost always get out of hand from their original creators.
His actions. And as it turned out, said response was going to be quite slow. It took several weeks before the Administratum even noticed that the planet had fallen in the first place. It may sound ridiculous, but in an Imperium consisting of hundreds of thousands, if not millions upon millions of worlds, the fall of one planet, even one of such relative importance as Vraks, hardly creates that much of a ripple in the Imperium's vast pond. And it's also very important to point out that it was far from guaranteed that the Imperium would even try to take the world back. In the grand scheme of things, Vraks and its population of some 8 million souls was barely a blip on the radar. The important part was the weapons stored on the planet. The potential consequences of Imperial Guard regiments throughout the Skada sector being rendered combat ineffective due to a lack of supplies were considerably harder to overlook than the loss of the planet itself and its population. It was, of course, also the case that this was not necessarily an anti-imperial uprising. It is rare, but on occasion a local revolt might overthrow their overlords. Let's, for example, say that a planet is suffering beneath a particularly brutal and oppressive local regime. The population might rise up and overthrow the local ruling class. And as long as this insurrection has no negative impact upon the planet's commitments to the wider Imperium, it may simply be ignored. As long as the Imperium receives its tithes and the planet remains true to its obligations to the Imperium, then it might very well simply be better to live and let live.
See, this is the sort of calculus that real-world dictators and authoritarians have to make in order to survive. And again, you look at the fact that Zaphon looted the armories meant that he crossed a Rubicon that he would have to fight against the Imperium, which when you're in the middle of Imperial space is a really, really bad decision because there's nobody else who you can reach out to for assistance. And so, again, you're much more likely to see some sort of scenario in which the Imperium would actually stand to gain or would believe they stood to gain by Cardinal Zaphon taking over. So perhaps if Zaphon advocated for a greater level of contribution to the imperial tithes, maybe the Imperium would be inclined to, look the other way. Right? Economic realities always are a factor when it comes to how strongly another country chooses to enforce its values. You don't need to look very far into history to find this. As we all know, the People's Republic of China is they are executing a full-scale genocide, but conveniently, despite almost every other country in the world signing a treaty against exactly this sort of systematic genocide, hardly anyone speaks out about it. And that's because China knows that they are too economically tied in to every other developed nation, and those are the only ones that would lead the charge against them. But these developed nations know that their population would be furious if they were unable to buy poorly made Chinese goods on Amazon. And so, political realities, economic realities dictate. Same way that the Imperium, as Arch said, would let this sort of thing slide if they stood to gain or at least weren't going to be actively harmed by a change in government.
No harm, no foul. And at first glance, it would appear as if Vraks certainly fulfilled some of those conditions. The revolt had been a spontaneous happenstance. It had been caused more by the Inquisition than, honestly, the Cardinal. And that, of course, was another thing. The revolt was not led by some backwater warlord or insurrectionist, but rather by an anointed member of the imperial cult, a cardinal, no less. And it wasn't even started on his command. One would think that these would be extenuating circumstances. However, there was one very big problem that put all of this well beyond the realm of simply live and let live. Namely, the fact that the Cardinal had been spewing some rather aggressive rhetoric. He had, for several years now, been announcing that he was to lead a great crusade to sweep sin away from the Skara sector, an imperial sector. Now, if he'd been announcing a crusade on a neighboring sector, one filled with chaos deviants or filthy xenos, that might have been something else. But the situation as it stood right now was that a firebrand cardinal, who had essentially been preaching holy war on his own sector, was now not only in possession of an army of zealous followers, but also a nearly infinite supply of weapons, armor, vehicles, tanks, aircrafts, artillery, and anything else he might wish to equip them with.
And see, here's another one of the problems that you run into, that all governments run into when it comes to organizations or groups within their countries that use this sort of rhetoric. Is every organization or entity that wants to get people to take some sort of action, it needs to use highly charged, highly emotional language to do it. Human beings are rational, certainly, and if you want them to do something, you have to either reward them, you have to pay them, or you have to put them in such a great emotional state that they believe that they must take action. And while entities like corporations or experienced politicians know that they need to respond to real incentives, and that, rhetoric is pretty empty in the grand scheme of things. They also recognize, entities, that people need to get fired up. And a way to do that is with very over-the-top rhetoric. The problem that you run into is distinguishing the difference between, look at Colonel Zafin. Here's a guy who uses rhetoric like crusade, washing away sin, a rebirth, purifying the sector, right? And it's tough to say. That's language that carefully threads the needle. You notice that it wasn't a concrete threat. It wasn't a communication of violence. It wasn't an instruction to anyone, right? They're vague terms. Is washing away sin, that could be everything from a baptism to a massacre. Going on a crusade to, restore or increase or spread your faith, right? That could be everything from a missionary with a Bible and a lame-looking button-up t-shirt all the way to a knight in plate armor with a sword demanding people convert. And it's really hard for governments really to distinguish between rhetorical flourish and concrete threats. And again, you can infer, as we see here, based on action, right, beyond the rhetoric. So if a religious figure talks about the need to wash the world away of sin and buys Bibles for their followers, then that they're probably more of the missionary with the shirt variety. And if they start buying, nitrate fertilizer, then that you may be looking at a potential violent insurrection. But this is hard to do in a lot of cases. If you haven't seen it, there's a really interesting documentary, I think called Wild Wild Country, about a cult organization that slowly over time became more and more violent and became what meets the requirements of an insurrection. Fascinating look at how those sort of things, how hard it can be for outside entities to distinguish from legal activities and protected speech and peaceful organization, and to distinguish that from preparations for violent insurrection.
There was also the matter of the assassination attempt. If news of that got out, and the cardinal was not punished, then not only would that send a message that he was outside of the Inquisition's justice, it might also be used as a tool by the cardinal to increase his fame and spread his word to even more zealous followers. He could quite literally flaunt the fact that he had escaped the Inquisition's justice. He was beyond their justice, in fact, because he was only beholden to the Emperor's justice, not some false inquisitorial organization that functioned only at the behest of the clerks and shopkeepers of the vile Adeptus Administratum. This would...
Okay, I'll be curious to see if Arch tells me that he's done this. But if you are a good dictator and you already have, or a cult leader, and you already have people believing or wanting, or primed, if you will, to believe that you have a divine power, and you have survived a assassination attempt by a very skilled assassin, this is the time where you demonstrate your miraculous divine survival. You notice how, especially in this instance, right, we know that mechanically that he survived because he had a personal shield and it was able to slow the bullet enough to protect the cardinal from harm, and that is why he survived, right? There is no magic at work. But his followers, he has the advantage of almost all the pieces of evidence you would need to prove to your followers that he survived through a divine miracle. A body of an assassin sent by the Imperium, an assassin who probably by imperial propaganda never fails. He has, of course, the bruised rib. He has witnesses to the assassination, witnesses who would probably be willing to corroborate a just slightly propagandized version of events. Again, this is the sort of thing that you see, North Korea is the classic example where they have some real world truths that they incorporate into a larger mythos around their leader. So the town of their birth is recorded correctly, but they'll add flourishes like a bald eagle sat atop the house as he was born, or the sun and moon came down from the heaven, right? Preposterous stuff. But you take a grain of truth, and for which evidence strongly exists, you add just a tiny element of fiction, and then you present the evidence of the reality, and you say, look, the emperor himself stopped that bullet, saving the cardinal. He is truly blessed. Here's the bullet. Here's the assassin. Here are his ribs. No normal man could survive this assassination attempt. The Inquisition never fails, yet he has. It's a miracle. And his followers, who are already primed to see him as divine, will look at that evidence and interpret it as a divine act.
Would unavoidably increase the cardinal's influence quite considerably, to the point that even if he were to be removed at a later date, the damage would almost certainly have been done, as the cardinal's followers would have increased in numbers drastically and spread to dozens of other worlds within the Scaris sector. Once they received word of his death, they would almost certainly come to the conclusion that he had been assassinated, and thusly the revolt that had taken place on Vraks and ended with the overthrow of the world would then take place on dozens of other worlds. This insurrection could simply not be ignored. Vraks would have to be retaken, and it would have to happen on the ground. The deployment of planet-cracking ordnance was briefly considered and then rejected. The weapons and vehicles stored on Vraks were enough to supply an entire subsector. The planet was one thing, but the weapons, those were far too valuable to simply destroy. Orbital bombardment, as well as the deployment of chemical or biological weapons of exterminator's grade, were also considered and rejected. The full extent of the Vraxian capital was protected by multiple overlapping void shields, along with orbital defense silos, both torpedo and laser batteries. The defenses could be cracked, but it would require the deployment of far too great of a force, and cost far too many ships to be considered a practical solution. Similarly, the deployment of, for example, the Life Eater virus, which would scrub the planet clean of even the most minuscule trace of biological life that might be found on the barren rock, was considered, and again, rejected. It would do little to the defenders in their sealed and hardened defenses. It would, however, immensely inconvenience any follow-up ground invasion, as most, if not all, of the planet's water would be boiled away, and any hopes of feeding the troops locally by the creation of algae farms, one of the few things capable of living on Vraks, would also be gone. The simple truth of the matter was that Vraks had been designed to resist just the kind of invasion the Imperium was now contemplating. But that was now the problem of the Lord Commander Obscurus.
Okay, that's an interesting point. This was one of my biggest complaints about Vraks, is that there's so many other options, and I believe, in retrospect, that the Imperium would probably choose to implement something like a Life Eater virus, even just to render the surface of the planet uninhabitable, and to accept that they were going to have to wait out these Vraxian troops that were hunkered down in bunkers. I think that forcing them into these enclosed bunkers when they're already kind of religious fanatics is actually a great idea because religious fanatics are always interested in testing each other's purity and seeking out the impure, and without an external enemy to render pure, they always seem to turn on each other, trying to, of course, find heresy and a lack of faith among their peers. So, I think that was probably a mistake to not implement that. Again, the Imperium boiling off life on a world, not a big deal. And ultimately, if all they wanted were the weapons, then that would be a relatively straightforward process. Also, again, we're talking about the Death Corps of Krieg here. They are experts at surviving on lifeless wastelands. So I don't think it would be as unfeasible as they think to run the Life Eater virus, let it really chew through everything for, 5-6 years, and then have a cleanup crew execute a ground invasion and work through the remaining troops, who, again, I strongly suspect would have self-eliminated a large portion of their number. But hindsight is always 20/20, and as we know, the Siege of Vraks went quite haywire. So at the time, with what they knew, it's probably not unreasonable to think that they could try to save more of the planet than they ultimately were able to.
The Administratum had made their decision and signed the necessary documents. They had washed their hands, and it was now up to the commanders on the ground to find the necessary men to pay the price that Vraks would so surely demand. This sparked yet another round of discussion by the military command of the Obscurus sector as to how precisely this was to be done, as they undoubtedly wondered to themselves for about the 100th time if those murderously incompetent desk humpers back on Terra had even the faintest hint of a clue as to what it was they were asking of them. Many senior officers even went to the length of suggesting that the order might be refused, or at the very least questioned, or possibly even buried in so much paperwork that even the Administratum would eventually give up and forget all about it.
This is a tale as old as time. So, in democratic countries, or countries that select their leadership through some sort of electoral process and general suffrage, these countries ultimately have their militaries governed or commanded by civilians. This is true in the United States. We have a civilian Secretary of Defense, and we have civilian, deputy secretaries and that sort of thing. And it's been a sort of, I'm going to say, troubling trend of having 4-star generals who recently retire, or sometimes even just retire to take the post of defense secretary. I think that's pretty problematic. The principle of having civilians in charge of the military is very important, because in many other non-democratic countries, the militaries will function as kingmakers. The individuals to whom they are loyal are the ones they support and continue to enable their governance. And when a dictator or an oligopoly loses the support of the military, then they are quickly replaced by someone the military does support. And this can be direct. This can literally be, airborne troops marching into the presidential palace and escorting out the old president and installing their commander-in-chief. But it can also be things as simple as they discuss here, the military demonstrating a vote of no confidence in an elected leader and refusing to do orders, slowing the rate at which they complete instructions, and sometimes even just publicly supporting an opposition candidate or their preferred leader of the country. So you end up with this tail wagging the dog type situation, as the Astra Militarum is discussing here, where they in fact dictate the execution of policies set by civilians. But again, ultimately, the civilian leadership is an important principle in democratic countries because it ensures that the largest collection of force in those countries is ultimately answerable to elected civilian leaders and is not the military becoming a self-serving entity.
They postulated that the cost in men and materials required to recapture the stores on Vraks would at best break even, and in all due likelihood prove to be a net loss. In their view, the Administratum had already evicted the contents of their reprehensibly odious assholes all over the carpet, and it was all a bit too late to try.
Also, Arch's disgust for the Administratum is like pretty visceral.
And shove the repugnant mess back up the rear entry fundament of whichever worthless Administratum drone was responsible. The only thing that would result in, they stated, was a lot of wasted time and a lot of broken broom handles. Naturally, the Lord Commander took these opinions under consideration for a whole 7 seconds before informing his subordinates that they were welcome to go bitch and whine to their favorite officer's mattress on their own damn time, but as long as their clearly over-decorated torsos were hanging about in his command center, they would recognize the fact that they were commanding officers of the Imperial Guard, and served the God Emperor of Mankind, who in this particular occasion had handed them a most holy mission that just so happened to take the form of a data wafer with the High Lords of the Administratum's signature on it.
Yep, this is a excellent, though profanity-laden summary of the conflict between militaries and civilians. But it's interesting, in the, I think, late 1700s, early 1800s, there was a theorist named Karl von Clausewitz who, again, this is one of the first modern writers to think about warfare in the sense that we as modern societies think of it. Again, pre-modern warfare sometimes had like a ritual component. Sometimes it involved like rites and ceremonies. Sometimes it was not even for stakes. But in the modern times, right, where you had nation states who would engage each other in warfare for different stakes and different contentions, Karl von Clausewitz was the first to write about it. And one of his overarching principle, the conclusion that informed everything else in his work, so much so that when he came to the conclusion, he actually tried to rewrite his previous works to reflect it, and that is that war is the continuation of politics by other means, meaning that war is not a distinct and special animal from politics. And we see this in the modern era, right? This thinking continues because we almost never hand the keys to warfighting over to the generals. We don't point them in a direction and say, kill until you reach the capital, right? We add political conditions that reflect the things we're trying to achieve, we being the government of a country. And so the example being like the United States and Afghanistan. Could the United States occupy the territory of Afghanistan? It did, and it could. And it could, in theory, eliminate every Afghan in the country. But of course, it doesn't, because that's not the political objectives. The political objectives are to create a stable democracy, one in which terrorists do not find a safe haven to attack the United States, and then they added a whole bunch of tertiary objectives that don't really make any sense. But the point is that the civilian leadership had political objectives, that some of those objectives fell into the realm of the military to realize. And this principle sounds like it remains true in the Astra Militarum, who ultimately, for all the complaints about better ways things could be done, this is a political operation. And Arch has described in good detail why this political choice is necessary, about sending a message to other governors, about retaining the readiness of the defenses in the other sector, maybe to even deter other potential enemies that might want to attack the subsector. So all these larger political considerations are things that militaries don't have to focus on, because it's important that they focus entirely on being ready and capable of fighting enemies. But it also means that they don't really always understand the constraints they're placed under.
Finally, if any amongst them still held misgivings about the sanctity, and indeed the necessity of the mission, the Lord Commander would be more than pleased to round up the usual 6 guardsmen and help the doubting officer in question bring his misgivings directly to the God Emperor. Did I mention, by the way, that the Lord Commander was Cadian, and that Cadians are quite fond of interpreting orders rather literally? No? Well, now you know. To be clear, though, even the Lord Commander didn't have much hope in this endeavor ending in anything but vast quantities of mangled corpses, but he had been given an order, and in the Imperial Guard you do not question orders, at the very least not if you know what is best for your long-term health prospects. So with that settled...
This is true of most militaries. There's some developed Western militaries that have these carve-outs for illegal, immoral, or unethical orders where you are allowed to question them. There's also a cultural thing among the officer corps or among NCOs, but mostly among the officer corps, where your staff have leeway to push back on orders, always privately, never in front of others. And these usually are things that look more like discussions among experts, reaching a consensus. But the ultimate decider is, of course, the commander. An example of this might be a commander who says, I want to cover 200 miles in this advance on the first day. And that's when their supply, their S4, military term, their supply and logistics officer says, well, sir, actually, we only have enough fuel to do 100 miles, and if we do that extra 100, there's no guarantee we'll be able to get fuel into the tanks to fight. And that's the sort of pushback on an order that commanders count on their staff to do, right? And the commander may ask for clarification, and he may consider, hey, I think it's an acceptable risk to make these advances on day one, right? But these are the questioning of orders that are absolutely necessary for commanders to make good decisions and to have staff they can rely on.
The question remained how to go about planning an attack on a world designed from its very inception to be impervious to attack. Since the more extreme options had already been considered and rejected by those higher up the food chain, the Lord Commander was left to ponder the more conventional options. Luckily, Vraks being an imperial world and all, or, well, used to at least, the Imperium had access to pretty much any and all information they wanted on its defenses. Considerably less fortuitous was the sheer size of the folder created once all of these defenses were listed and compiled. The first and most obvious option to get around said defenses were simply to not engage them at all. A lightning strike from orbit directly onto the central spaceport would avoid the majority of the ground defenses, and at the end of the day, those defenses were Vraks' primary strength. The PDF, even if it was substantially strengthened by zealots and by breaking open the armories, would only number a couple of million at most, and the majority of those troops would be fairly poorly trained and led. It stood to reason then that if a hammer blow could be delivered swiftly, by the deployment of Adeptus Astartes forces straight to the enemy's central nervous system and command structure, their resistance could be shattered quickly. Imperial Guard elements would then follow in the Space Marine's wake of destruction and strike directly towards the main citadel, thusly cutting off the head of the proverbial serpent. This would leave the remainder of the planet's PDF defenses entrenched relatively safely within their defenses, but without leadership or access to the various resources and supplies of the main citadel, they could simply be ignored until they eventually, and inevitably, wilted on the vine. It wasn't all perfect, however. The plan had some pretty severe risks attached to it. If the force was unable to quickly break through the starport guards, or they were unable to bring in sufficient reinforcements, the invasion force could easily find itself surrounded and eventually destroyed. But in all due reality, if led by the Astartes and supported by Tempestus stormtroopers, such an assault had a relatively slim chance of failure. There was, however, one considerably larger problem, namely that this was by far the most obvious approach. And so Vraks had been built with it in mind from the very beginning. As many as 100 orbital defense lasers ringed the citadel and starport. These guns were organized into massive batteries and buried deep underground in reinforced bunkers. Even the mighty Battlefleet Solar would consider Vraks a tough nut to crack from orbit, and without first neutralizing the defense batteries, any invasion force was sure to be met with murderous casualties. And that would be before they even reached the low-level anti-air artillery, much less the ground itself. The casualty rates of such a drop were estimated to be somewhere in the vicinity of 96%. And even the God Emperor's avenging angels, well used to long odds, would consider those to be little more than suicide. And without the Astartes, the all-important tip of the spear, the hammer in the hammer blow, it was extremely unlikely that whatever small force made it down to the surface would be able to take the starport, much less the citadel itself. Tempting as it was to try for a quick resolution to the conflict, the low odds on offer made such an attempt foolhardy at best. However, a variation of the plan was suggested. The general idea was still the same. The planet was to be taken by a single, massive strike, straight to the starport. But rather than being the initial action of the campaign, it would come at the very end of a long campaign of strategic destruction. Firstly, the Imperial Navy would be deployed in strength to blockade the system. Blockading Vraks itself should be an easy task, as it had no real fleet, but it was expected that a significant force would be needed to make sure that no outside forces intervened. And considering that the potential prize for such an intervention was an entire planet's worth of weapons and armor, the Navy force would have to be considerable indeed to act as a sufficient deterrent. Once the blockade was in place, the second phase of the operation would begin. This was the part that was going to take a very long time indeed. 100 years, by the more optimistic estimates. Over the course of the following century, repeated large-scale raids by elite forces would be launched upon the planet, aiming to pick away at its defenses, one strong point at a time. The eventual goal of each succession of raids was to leave one of the planetary laser bunkers vulnerable to attack, and then destroy it, with the eventual aim of the campaign being to neutralize all, or at least the vast majority, of Vraks' anti-orbital weapons. And only then could the third and final phase, the actual attack on the starport itself, be launched. All in all, it was a relatively safe strategy. As long as the Imperium retained full void dominance, they could rapidly deploy their raiding forces wherever they wanted. The defenders would have to defend the entire length of their frontage, whilst the Imperials could deploy all of their troops against one sector at a time. Even if they ran into the occasional setback, the overwhelming local advantage caused by such a strategy would surely see the Imperials victorious in most of their engagements. It was also suggested that perhaps the planet could be forced into submission through the blockade alone. But one quick glance at the sheer volume of ready-to-eat rations packs stored on Vraks, along with the planet's water reserves and potential algae farms, quickly dispelled any such hope. However, the first plan was sound. The problem was the schedule. 100 years.
Okay, so let's talk about which strategy is the winner. First off, here's the thing. You really don't want to attack an enemy where they are strongest and where they expect you, in the manner they expect you. Second, if you don't want to train an enemy to fight you, right? Human beings, militaries especially, they work a little bit like a bacterial infection in your immune system. If you take a low dose of antibiotics or you don't take your full course, right, you're training that bacteria to survive those antibiotics. But if you take the full course properly the first time, you eliminate all of the bacteria and they never survive long enough to learn or evolve how to stop you. Classic example is the insurgency in Iraq, right? This is a group that was unable to, they were totally unable, right? As a country, Iraq was unable to resist the U.S. invasion. And early in the U.S. invasion, they were disorganized. They struggled to launch effective attacks. But month after month, year after year, the insurgent forces developed better tactics, became better organized, and every time the United States would develop a new tool or tactic or procedure to counter them, the U.S. would never exploit that advantage sufficiently, and the surviving insurgents would evolve and learn a new way to counter it. They would change how they communicated to avoid communications intercepts. They would change how they deployed IEDs to avoid this countermeasure or that countermeasure. They changed trigger devices, right? Going from cell phones to command wires to pressure plates as the U.S. fielded more and more gear. And so an incidental result of this was that the insurgent forces effectively were trained, lethally so, but trained by the United States to become highly effective military forces. The idea of taking 100 years of small-scale raids would mean that every decade, every year, the Vraxian defenders would actually get better and better and better. This is a huge problem when you already have this high level of equipment. So what's sort of interesting to think about is that this is a case where subversion is probably going to be their best bet. If there is any way they could get troops into Vraks, or even just, again, like a single assassin, and disable just a small number of these batteries, right, you may have a positive result. Another option is to try to thwart the batteries. This would be my thought, is do the large-scale initial invasion, right, which they say, hey, 96% casualty rate. Okay, that's pretty terrible. But what if your drop pods were 50, 60, 70% decoys, empty drop pods, right? Now you won't have the high casualty rate, right? You'd have to do some math, but if they're destroying 96% of drop pods, but only 50% are manned at all, then your invasion force you'll double the amount of defenders that land on the ground, right? Math guys in the comments, you got to help me out with this. But if, let's say, you were able to make only 1 in 10 drop pods actually contain your troops, and you were to just say, we're going to blot out the sky, right? Maybe that could work. So you've got to think a little outside the box, and you have the advantage of the fact that you know exactly how all these anti-air defenses work. Other options include things like not dropping directly onto the heavily defended starport, but dropping elsewhere from, say, behind an entrenched line, right? There's lots of hybrid options, and strategies need to be fleshed out. These are in the military we train to present what are called courses of action, right? And they have to meet some requirements, but among them is that they have to be really distinct and they have to be fully thought out, right? You can't just say something like, well, we're going to do a siege. And no, the course of action has to involve a plan for logistics, an exact maneuver scheme, an exact plan for subordinate units. It really has to be all the way thought out, because there's a huge difference between a theoretical idea you've kind of thought about in principle and then actually walking through fleshing it out. And you have to make sure you do each of those because for the reasons they're describing, right? Here's general plans, here's a reason they can't work, but there's no like next step in the thinking of, hey, how do we execute this plan? Can we work around these problems? And again, this is what you have a good staff for. Staff will spend some time. They'll work through these sort of problems to find, hey, what is the viable version of a lightning strike? What is the viable version of hybrid raiding? What is the viable version of a siege, right? And it's going to look unique to every operation.
100 years of maintaining a blockade, tying up valuable shipping. 100 years tying up Imperial Guard regiments, Tempestus stormtroopers, and possibly even Adeptus Astartes. 100 years of supplying and reinforcing said regiments, and finally, 100 years of the heretics looting Vraks' stores, the very things they were supposed to be reclaiming. The plan was finally rejected as far too timid, and whilst it was likely to succeed, the fruits of any eventually guaranteed victory compared to the costs expended to gain it were deemed to be insufficient. Very well. The third and final option, then, was a conventional siege. In this scenario, vast Imperial Guard forces would be brought down to the planet, then subsequently entrenched around the Citadel and its concentric defensive rings. Those entrenchments would then be used as basis of operation, and the enemy defenses would be hammered into the Vraxian soil by a combination of mass assault and artillery barrages. The logic behind it all was simple, if cold, and somewhat brutal. If the battle became one of attrition, then the Imperium, with its vastly superior near-limitless resources, both in manpowers, vehicles, artillery, and ammunition, could not possibly fail to obtain victory. But at what price? A lengthy siege by a large number of Imperial Guard regiments that would necessarily have to be involved in heavy and sustained fighting would naturally result in a fair bit of losses. But that inevitability might also be used in the Imperium's favor. Assuming the Administratum was willing to allocate enough men and resources, and assuming a casualty ratio of 2 to 3 guardsmen for every traitor, with the traitors' numbers of course being a known quantity, or at least so they thought, calculations show that the war would last an approximate 12 Terran years, and cost between 2 to 6 million guardsmen. Now, finally, we were getting somewhere. 12 years was considered to be an acceptable timeline, and the cost in human lives was also considered to be a more than worthwhile bargain to regain control of the massive supply depots located in and under the Citadel. The wheels of the Administratum began to turn. Millions upon millions of men would need to be found, armed, clothed, fed, trained, and transported.
This is actually a huge problem in militaries. People really forget this all the time. That if you want to have military operations, let's say something very basic like distributing aid in a famine in a country experiencing a famine. Well, if you want your military to do it, you need to have, let's say your target number is 1,000 soldiers. Well, those 1,000 soldiers are actually doing the work, right? Those 1,000 soldiers will need 3 meals a day for, again, let's pick some nice round numbers, for 100 days. 1,000 soldiers, 100 days, right? You need 3 meals a day times 100 days. So you're times 1,000 troops, but then you also have to have logistics troops, right? You have to have a logistics chain, troops or contractors. And so then you have to, of course, feed them. And you run into the same problem with things like porta-johns, right? Bathrooms. Sounds crazy until but if you've ever read the stories about pre-modern militaries, you know that germs are a killer and you just can't have a policy of go wherever you want. So you've got to ensure cleanliness and facilities. And so if you want to have those facilities, you've got to kind of maintain them. And if you have that many people, they have to be able to protect themselves, right? So you have to have a fortification, a base. And those base needs to have guards that are always on duty. And then you have to think about things like, well, does the base need to have water? And when you're talking about water, now you're up to a gallon per person per day. And you need to have, of course, more logistics troops to move the water. And so you see how it actually scales out as a problem, right? So in order to have 1,000 shooters, you have to have, at least, it used to be in World War II, it was like 12 support personnel to allow one shooter to function. Now we've narrowed it somewhat through technology and through contractors down to about 3. But in the age of the Imperium, given how the Astra Militarum is organized, I imagine that you would see something closer to that 12-person ratio, right? So these 14 million Krieg guardsmen they're going to deploy, or however many, 2 million or whatever it may be, they are going to be accompanied by a huge contingent of transport folks, logistics folks, maintainers, ammo specialists, just all of it. And they're all going to have to be fed. They're all going to have to be clothed. And then the more you have to feed, clothe, and fuel these operations, the more people it requires, the more of all those things it requires. So it becomes this like self-licking ice cream cone, and it is a huge challenge for militaries. And basically, that's why they say there's an old saying that amateurs talk tactics, experts talk logistics, and that's because, as they've correctly stated here, as Arch has stated, that if you can win logistically, you actually don't need a tremendous tactical advantage. As long as you can sustain the fight longer, you will eventually come out on top.
Millions of las rifles would need producing, millions more of power packs, vox speeds, helmets, bayonets, and all the miscellaneous trappings of an Imperial soldier. Not to mention the weapons required to break the fortifications. Thousands of guns and millions of shells were merely the first entries on a mile-long list of necessities. But first things first. The undertaking required a name and a leader. The former was to be the 88th Imperial Guard Siege Army, and the latter role fell to Lord Commander Julke. A somewhat confusing choice, but then on the other hand, an eminently predictable one as well. The Lord Commander did not have much in the way of military experience, at least not beyond the plush and comfortable surroundings of his Upspire estate at the hands of his private tutors from the Imperial Academy. What he did have, though, was a prestigious name and a proud military heritage. His great-grandfather had even served as an attaché to the Lord Solar on Terra. He needed a first posting, and for the sake of his further career, it needed to be a victory. And statistically speaking, Vraks was as good as a done deal. The Administratum had committed to providing the necessary men and material. Subsequently, all that needed doing was to keep the attrition in accordance with the 12-year time plan. In sharp contrast to the reality for the humble guardsman, the lot of a Lord Commander on Vraks was an easy one. And considering the static nature of the engagement, he barely even had to do any planning. It was a nice, cushy job for a nice, cushy man.
I just think it's great when you see, and this is true of, I'm going to say probably every military, that the volume of awards you get for peacetime stuff is insane. Is ridiculous. And actually, I mean, I understand where it comes from, right? In the U.S. Army, you get airborne wings for completing airborne school, which is a good school, but it's not that hard. If you can run, 6 miles at probably like a 10-minute mile pace, you'll be fine and do a pull-up. You'll be fine at airborne school, right? But you do your 5 jumps and you get jump wings. You wear them the rest of your career. If you can pass a test of a series of infantry skills, they will actually give you an expert infantryman's badge, which you can wear, again, your entire career. While it's great to pass infantry skills, there's another one for combat medics. You can end up with this result where you just complete peacetime schools, you complete peacetime trainings, and you end up with this chest full of awards, and you have almost no operational experience. And it's true, peacetime armies, they need this sort of thing, right, for morale purposes and to motivate soldiers and to continue to train and fight hard. But then you get the result like this, or the classic like North Korean general with 100 million awards, despite the fact that they've never been more than 5 miles outside of Pyongyang. So, again, I mean, it's funny. This guy, his uniform is depicted as being like a parody, right? And in fact, if you look at like, North Korean generals are the classic ones. I think Chinese generals are similar, right? They have a gajillion awards, which are usually for things like successfully doing your job. Oh, you were posted once to a rocket site and you didn't you didn't screw it up. All right, here's an award. And again, the U.S. military does it too, right? They call them PCS awards, permanent change of station awards, where they say, hey, you came to this unit, you did a good job, thanks for working hard, here's an award. But yeah, it's sort of preposterous. And actually, fun fact, it is in compliance with regulation to not wear all your decorations. And I want to say it's like Admiral McCraven famously wears like 3. He wears it's a huge flex. It's like a Bronze Star with a V device. His like Afghanistan campaign ribbon from when he was like the commander of Special Operations Forces, and like a Purple Heart or something, right? He's got just 3 huge flex awards, and he wears nothing else. And I think it's the most gangster move.
But whilst the overall commander was potentially somewhat lacking, the choice of meat for the grinder was not. The choice fell upon the famous Death Corps of Krieg. If you haven't already, I strongly recommend pausing this video and taking a look at the Death Corps of Krieg video, as it goes into depth as to the history and the organization of both the Death Corps, and another video on the Vraksian defenders. Now, whatever the Lord Commander's shortcomings might be, he was at least an adequate administrator. He organized a large staff around himself and set about the task of setting his armies into order, and eventually preparing them for transportation. The administratum did most of the heavy logistical lifting, but how, when, and who to move and to where was up to the Lord Commander's headquarters, which incidentally was placed upon the planned Thracian Primaris, a comfortable distance away from Vraks itself, but at least in the same system. After all, there was no real reason for the Lord Commander to inconvenience himself. The war was already as good as won. All he had to do was to make sure that the casualties were kept up. Preferably on both sides.
Yeah, this is interesting. This is one of the things that differs from my experience. Usually the level of insecurity around a commander with no combat experience, especially when they are surrounded by or their peers have significant combat experience, that level of insecurity can actually reach like the pathetic. In my experience, you would have this commander like this, and they would place their headquarters like unnaturally close to the front line. They would force their staff to live in like needlessly harsh conditions as some sort of demonstration of their toughness or their commitment to something. The level of insecurity displayed by non-combat officers is significant. And I'm on this rant actually. I spent some time with my brother this past weekend, and he is an Iraq veteran. I'm an Afghanistan veteran. We both had military careers of length. And it's interesting now that, it's been 10 years since both of us commissioned. So it was very interesting to just talk about sort of the culture of the military, the culture of officership, and this is one of the topics that came up, like the bizarre insecurity that the military kind of can breed in its officers, right? And that there's always, no matter how good and how much you do, there's always going to be somebody who feels like the real deal, and you always feel like a fraud. My brother said he felt it. I'll tell you, I feel it, right? Because, I led a bunch of combat patrols, and, sometimes we had some enemy encounters, but, the real badasses are the special forces teams, right? They're, going after it, getting intel, hitting houses, kicking doors, getting in gunfights. Like, truth is, we would wake up every day. I'd get my intel brief. We'd plan our, we had our patrol routes like planned already. I planned a week ahead of time. And then we would just go on a patrol. And 90% of them, nothing happened. We talked to some people. We wrote down some intel. We came back. We wrote a report, right? So, but that's the thing. It's like you'll never win. I'm sure if you ask those special forces guys, they would explain to you how they weren't the real badasses, how the real badasses were, super secret Delta Force, top secret mission, gee whiz, stealth everything, right? And who knows? Maybe if you ask the Delta Force guys, maybe they have some other like BA person. They're like, oh, the real badasses are the CIA clandestine agents who are out there with no support and infiltrating terror. Who knows, right? You'll never win, and it's sort of toxic to think that way. I think, because you'll never be happy with yourself. You'll spend all your time and energy chasing something that you'll never get. But man, but there are real distinctions, right? And if you're an officer who is not deployed and done your job in a combat environment, that's a huge, and your country is at war, or your Imperium is at war, that's a huge distinction. That's a huge gap between you and your peers.
And that fresh blood continued to flow into the besieging army. And speaking of said army, Krieg, as always, stood ready to deliver whatever the God Emperor might wish for, and the men and material to transform the 88th Siege Army from a paper formation into a fully fledged conquering force was swiftly provided. Transportation and logistical supply would be handled by the Imperial Navy, and with the establishment of a general headquarters on Thracian Primaris, the pieces all began falling into place. And so, with the final delivery of the Lord Commander's favourite feathered couch and a fully stocked bar cabinet, the reconquest of Vraks could begin. And I am sure that the Lord Commander's men took great comfort in knowing that his lordship's generously upholstered backside would be eminently comfortable, and not suffer too much in the way of deprivations as the harsh realities of war began to sink in. As for the men who had the simple task of dying in acceptable proportions to the enemy, they were even now on their way down to the planet's surface. Massive Imperial Guard landing ships would deploy entire regiments at a time, as they swiftly set about fortifying several landing zones around the Vraxian capital. The fear was that the Cardinal would launch a large-scale riposte as the Krieg forces were landing and at their most vulnerable, seeking to destroy the invasion force piecemeal as they were ferried down. Death Rider companies were amongst the first to arrive and swiftly galloped out into the surrounding landscape to warn of just such an attempt. But as the hours and then days began to pass, it seemed as if the defenders were fully content to stay within their fortified bunkers, and let the Imperials deploy in peace. But why would he do so? On one hand, the landings were a golden opportunity for the rebels to potentially inflict serious losses on the would-be besiegers, as they would have been caught in the open with minimal in the way of defenses and little room to maneuver, as well as being unable to bring to bear their full numerical might. But in reality, despite the damage that such a thrust could have caused, the Cardinal had no way of knowing the composition of the Imperium's response force. For all he knew, the moment his forces set themselves in motion and cleared their own defenses, drop pods filled with Astartes warriors could start hammering into his marching lines. In such an eventuality, the war on Vraks would have been short-lived indeed. No, it is much safer to simply hunker down in prepared positions and wait for the enemy to fully show their hand. Though it would certainly take quite a while to see the full extent of the Imperium's commitment. The Lord Commander was understandably a bit paranoid that such a prize as Vraks might already have attracted unwanted attention, and the transport crafts were heavily escorted by the Imperial Navy. Once on the surface, the Death Corps began their preparations aided by a Munitorium labor corps of some 500,000 penal workers.
So here's one thing I do want to address that I think is important. We often, civilians, right, and movies and media, they love viewing war as like StarCraft, right? Where in StarCraft, you have a really clear idea of what your enemy is doing. And you have a really strong perception of that. But the reality of war is the level of messiness, the level of unknowns are astounding. And that's if you have a professional troop, right? A professional intelligence gathering operation. You know, these Krieg riders going out, they knew exactly how to report. They knew exactly what they were looking for. They were true professionals. Now imagine you don't have true professionals. Imagine you have a labor corps, right, effectively, and maybe they're not even literate, right? You've only recently started to disperse small arms, but you may not have any proficiency on your larger weapon systems. You don't have a chain of command established. You don't have a military-style headquarters, right? You don't have a process for making your decisions, for planning an operation. You don't have anything. And your people, at every level, there's a lack of proficiency. And so when you have that sort of situation, then what you've got to realize is that you may not understand or be physically able to launch a spoiling attack. Even if you were like, yes, a spoiling attack would be optimal right now. They're very vulnerable. They might say, plan a spoiling attack. And they'll have to, they might not know how many troops they have on the ground. They might not know the equipping status of those troops, right? They might not have the maps necessary to plan in advance, right? They might even not understand how to get ammunition to the troops, right? They might not have a plan in place. And all these sort of things are hard to do, and they're even harder when, as Arch discussed, you don't fully know what the enemy is planning. So it's naturally it makes sense that that the defenders are going to default to the static option, to the lowest energy state. And this is actually a really, classically in Soviet doctrine, commanders whose higher command is incapacitated and cannot issue orders, they are trained to freeze and stop. In the U.S. Army, they're doctrinally, you are supposed to continue the mission you were given, and actually you are always provided the mission and the intent of commanders 2 levels higher. So I would always know what not just my company commander wanted me to do, but what the battalion commander's intent was. And that was important because if circumstances changed, right, or I found myself in a situation or in a place or interacting with people that weren't part of the original mission plan, I knew overall what my battalion commander wanted me to do. And by knowing that, I was empowered as a platoon leader to make other decisions about how to respond to that new situation. And as long as I was informed by that intent, I could do so, right? I could take action and initiative. But that's not common for militaries. The more common response is, if your commander didn't authorize it, you don't do it. Right? And that's probably closer to what the defenders on Vraks would have been operating under, because it's a really simple form of command. It makes tracking your units really easy, because it's like, where is your 3rd battalion? You go, well, the 3rd battalion, we haven't talked to them in 2 days, but the last time we did, we told them to advance to this position. So they go, okay, they've probably advanced to this position and stopped. So we're reasonably certain that's what's happening. Right, and it enables unsophisticated command structures to plan and operate more effectively, more clearly. They can see their own forces better.
Whose primary job was to construct a vast network of railway lines that would run the length of the rear supply lines and the improvised starports. The Mechanicus arrived shortly thereafter with several armoured mass locomotion trains, gargantuan engines capable of transporting entire regiments along with all their heavy equipments the front line. Once the men of Krieg were in place, the engines would be used to haul the vast quantities of ammunition, food, water, spare parts, building materials, fuel, etc., 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 and all of the other myriad things the 88th Siege Army would need to function through the long years of the siege.
this is fascinating to me because railroads, right? You see how a rail system would enable such a quick resupply, especially if you're talking about encircling a single city, right? You can imagine how much faster that would be. And in World War I, railroads were also a decisive advantage, especially for the German forces that attacked in what was supposed to be a lightning-fast, rapid blow. And for World War I, right, advancing from Berlin to Paris in, I think it was supposed to be like 20 days, was lightning fast. But that was because the Germans used at the time the brand new technology of railroad logistics, or railroads, to move troops and material to the front line to continually keep them resupplied and to advance them through territory that had already been controlled.
It took a full year to get everything in place and ready to begin offensive operations. During this year, virtually no hostile actions were taken by either sides. The most aggressive that they got was the occasional ranging shot and perhaps a quick harassing barrage here and there. In the case of the Imperials, this was due to the simple fact that there was little point in going off half-cocked. The timetable had been set in stone before the first man even set foot on Vraks, and it allowed for a generous period of preparations. As for the Cardinal's forces, having lost the chance of a quick attack on the landing zones, any offensive moves at this point would simply serve to expose the defenders to the Krieg trench lines. It is also possible that the Cardinal thought that just maybe there was still a hope of negotiation, but if he made any official overtures, then they were all ignored, both by the besiegers and any chroniclers present. The Imperium had made its reply. It would be war, and Vraks was to be retaken. On the other hand, the Cardinal had also made his determination clear. At the very least, he intended to bleed the Imperium for a period of time until perhaps negotiations could be resumed. One should, however, also take into consideration that it is entirely possible that the Cardinal had fallen for his own propaganda, and was entirely convinced that once the Imperial intervention force was destroyed, he would lead a grand crusade out from Vraks to cleanse the sector of the heretics, the ne'er-do-wells, and any others that would stand in his way.
Yeah, I gotta say, this if there's one amateurish problem in the strategy with Vraks, it's a lack of appreciation of the difference in training and logistics that the Astra Militarum has in compared to these siege forces. The Vraxian forces will not respond quickly. They will struggle to communicate, to maneuver, and so the more you make them do that, the more you make them have to maneuver their forces, rearrange them, flex them, have them engage targets, different kinds of targets from different distances and different locations. The more you do that when you have poorly trained forces and your forces are well trained, the more decisive your advantage becomes. Right? Because that's the thing. Holding a static position, as we've seen in the previous Defenders video, is easy. It's probably one of the easiest things to do in warfare. This is why being a security guard gets you $15 an hour, is because it's not very difficult to do. But it's really hard to maneuver a formation of troops and have them fight in a different location. Right? You need to have planning, you need to have intelligence, you need to have a clear chain of command, you need to be able to remove troops from one location but backfill them with other troops. It's really tough. And if you want to beat an amateur force, even a well-equipped one, you do so by straining their ability to do that. Right? And so to me, the strategy of drop pods, lots and lots of decoys, drop down on the starport, combine it with a sort of frontline assault, and force their command to be stressed to the max. Force them to fight on two fronts, to deal with these people seizing the starport, to deal with their one line being heavily pressured, right? That is how you've got to do this. And the sooner you do it, the better, because they're only going to improve their organization with time. Usually. Again, unless you can do something like foment a rebellion. So this siege tactic is actually maybe one of the worst possible.
Very little is really known about the Cardinal's mindset at the time since, well, Imperial chroniclers do not tend to dedicate all that much time to understanding their enemy. Next episode, we're going to have a look at the makeup of the 88 Siege army, and how they were going to initiate battle on Vraks. Then, immediately after that, we're going to move on to the first proper combat operations against the renegade cardinal.
Alright guys, thank you for tuning in. Man, this was fun, and I'm excited to see the battle begin. We know, of course, that Vraks did not go so hot for the Imperium. No secret there. But I'm really curious to see how it all shakes out. Guys, be sure also to check it out. I have new merch. I've got the store down below. You can see here we're repping not the Death Corps, but we are repping Cadia. I've got some other shirts back there that are absolutely worth checking out. And yeah, be sure to check out the second channel. I'm uploading more content there every day. And until next time, I will see you guys later.